boundaries and boundary groups. All right, now why do we have boundaries? The purpose of the boundary is so that we can take each client and assign it to a primary site. If we are not able to assign a client to a primary site, then it becomes what we call an unmanaged client. And as such, there's not really an awful lot that we can do with it. It's very important to have it assigned to a primary site. The boundaries are useful with that, and they work in conjunction with boundary groups. It's not enough just to have a boundary. You also have to have a boundary group. But the boundaries are going to define the criteria that's used to determine which site to automatically use. And the various types of boundaries that we can use would be things such as an IP subnet. So maybe we have a specific IP subnet in one of our offices, and we want all IP clients in that office to use a specific primary site. Well, that would be a good example of that then. Or we could use an IP range. Maybe we don't want the entire subnet, but there's a range of addresses in that subnet that we're going to be using for clients where we want to assign them a primary site. And we would just carve out a range of addresses if that's the case. There's also an IP version 6 prefix. You do have to make sure that you have all of these smartly configured, by the way, because if you have overlapping subnets, for example, things like that, that's going to cause a lot of problems and confusion. And that does happen sometimes. I mean, it seems kind of like one of those "oh duh" statements. Of course you have to have good subnet design. But very often in larger organizations especially, some smaller branch office will come up with an addressing scheme of their own, even if it's a private addressing scheme, and it may overlap with a range that's used in some other part of the organization. So you got to make sure that this is properly done in the first place and smartly done, including also your Active Directory site design. And for this, you'll of course have to make sure that not only do you name your sites instead of using the default first site name for the first one, for example, that you name them, that you assign the proper IP subnets to those sites, and so forth. Because once again, if you decide to use a boundary type with an Active Directory site, but you never properly defined all of the subnets within that site, then again, you're going to wind up with unmanaged clients. Now, once you do come up with the boundaries, and you can choose whichever one of these you want, or multiple ones if you want, then the boundaries must be added to what we call a boundary group. And this is really where, once you have taken a boundary and added it to a boundary group, this is where you're going to be able to get the assignment to the primary site for your clients. Now, if you have a situation in which your client does not fall under any of the boundaries or boundary groups, then what happens? Well, then you have to assign it manually. I'm going to put manual over here. I guess I better spell it right first. Manual. And if you do it manually, you can assign it manually in the client installation property. And we'll be taking a look at the client again later on. I kind of keep putting that off, but that'll be coming up shortly here. This is where we're going to define what site code the client can use. You can use SMS site code equals auto, and that would make it just automatic based upon the boundaries and boundary groups that are defined. Or you can use SMS site code equals, and then you can specify PHX for Phoenix or whatever site code that you have determined. Then the other thing we could do is to use the client properties interface. If the client already has the client installed, then you can just manually go into control panel there and then determine and specify what you want its SMS site to be. The other thing is you have to use manual site assignment if the client's already assigned to a site. Maybe everything went fine. The boundaries were fine. The boundary groups were fine. It automatically got assigned to a SMS site code. But you had a shake-up in the department and you're moving things around and computers aren't in that location anymore. So you want to reassign it to a different site. That's one example of why you might need to use a manual. Or if the client is internet-based, where it's always picking up a different IP address, and something like this, IP subnets or IP ranges wouldn't work. And also, if it's just only an internet client, then the Active Directory site's not going to be useful either, because it's probably not even part of Active Directory in that conventional sense. But also, if the client will use DNS information to locate management points, or if the client's network location is not in any of these boundary or boundary groups. That's kind of what I was saying here earlier with the IP subnet and subnet range. Now, to clarify this further, let's just actually go over to the administration workspace. And within administration workspace, you configure the boundaries under hierarchy configuration, and then boundaries and boundary groups. And then what we'll do here is to first of all create a new boundary. So I'm just going to kind of type in some information here. I'll just call this my, oh, I'm typing and nothing's happening. Let's try this again. Let's call this our local 10 network. Okay, and you'll see why I call it that here coming up. But it would be a 10.10.10.0 subnet mask of 255.255.255.0, or in other words, a Class C subnet mask. And then I'll click on OK. Okay, so that's one of my boundaries. So we can use this a little bit later on in a boundary group, which I'll show you. But in other words, in order to make this really work also, I need to create a different kind of a boundary as well, an additional boundary, that is. And I'll call this my local 11 network. And it's also going to be an IP subnet. You can see the different ones that we could use here if we want to. And then this is going to be a 10.10.11.0. And then we'll go ahead and click OK here as well. So now we have a couple of different ones. Let's just do one more. Create an additional boundary. And I'll call this my local 12 network. Having trouble spelling today. All right, here we go. And then this will be a 10.10.12.0 with a 255.255.255 Class C subnet mask. And there we go. So now we have 3 separate subnets. And this might be the first floor subnet, second floor, third floor, different VLANs. Who knows? You get the idea, though, right? So now I've got a few different boundaries that I can work with, but they don't have much usefulness to me yet until I then go create a boundary group by right-clicking there. And I'll just call this my, local network group. And then we'll just add in the boundaries that we created earlier. You see, that's why I have to create the boundaries first and then add them to a boundary group, because now I have something to work with. Once I do that, I'll click on OK. And then that's pretty much it for assigning the boundaries to the group. But the references is what's going to be useful. I can use this boundary group for site assignment. Remember, that's the whole purpose, really, of coming up with a boundary and boundary groups, is because we need to have it for site assignment. And as such, I'm going to assign it to the Phoenix primary site. All right. Now, if I had other sites, other primaries that I could use, they would appear in this list. But I've just got the one. That's fine. Also, I've only got one site system server. Again, if you're not familiar with the terms there, I just described it in a previous nugget. But when I install Configuration Manager for the first time, the first site system server will have most of the default roles, or actually all of the default roles. And it's going to be pretty much suitable for running all of Configuration Manager unless I add something that's not included yet. And we may have to do that later on as we go through the series. But this is CM01, or Configuration Manager 01.nugetlab.com, is my site system server. It's the only one I've got, so it's a pretty easy dialog box to configure here. And then I click OK. Now, what's going to happen is if any of the clients that are in this part of this group, in other words, if any of the clients that have any of these IP addresses and they're associated with this group, then they're going to now receive the appropriate site and site server. In this nugget, we discussed boundaries and boundary groups. Stick around for our next nugget, where we'll be discussing discovery methods. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.